Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a topic that, well, it subtly but powerfully influences how we see the world and each other. Human stereotyping. We got some really interesting material here, mainly looking at insights from stereotyping, humans, AI, and society, to really get to the heart of this whole phenomenon.
Exactly. Yeah, our goal today is to explore this complex issue, pull out the most crucial understandings that, where do stereotypes actually come from? What effects do they have on us individually and together?
Right.
And interestingly, the role that artificial intelligence is starting to play in this, well, fundamentally human thing. We want to give you the essentials without getting too bogged down.
Yeah, keep it clear. And this source, it looks at stereotyping from so many angles: psychology, sociology, how our brains even process information.
It really does.
So our mission, if you like, is to bring all that together, find the key connections, and really understand the roots, the impact, and maybe the potential for change in how we categorize each other.
Sounds good.
Okay, so to kick things off, what exactly are we talking about when we say stereotyping? What's the basic idea?
Well, at its core, stereotyping is a mental shortcut. It's a way our brains try to make sense of a really complicated world.
A shortcut.
But it's also something we learn from society, right? It becomes a kind of shared understanding within a group.
Right. And from the brain's perspective, it sounds like we're just trying to keep up, with all the information hitting us constantly. And stereotyping is maybe one way our minds try to group things, simplify things, like creating quick mental labels just to handle the flood of social data we encounter every day.
Precisely. Psychologists talk about heuristics, these sort of mental tricks our brains use to make decisions quickly.
Ah, heuristics. Yes.
And stereotypes function a lot like those. They're for quick assessments. Instead of carefully evaluating every single person we meet, which would be exhausting.
Impossible, yeah.
We lean on these kind of ready-made general beliefs about the groups they belong to, these beliefs, these expectations about group members.
So it's like our brain saying, okay, that person fits category X and people in category X tend to be like this.
Yeah.
It's trying to create predictability, save some mental energy.
Exactly. The source even mentions it offering a kind of psychological relief, making the social world feel a bit less overwhelming, maybe more manageable.
Psychological relief. That's interesting. So the core idea there is that our brains are wired for efficiency, basically. And stereotypes offer a way to cut down the mental work.
That's a really important takeaway. There's definitely a cognitive upside in terms of simplification, saving energy. These functions probably helped us, evolutionarily.
So there's always a but.
But, and this is the critical point, these very same shortcuts can cause significant social harm. They can lead straight to prejudice, discrimination, especially when the generalizations are negative or just flat out wrong.
It's that tricky balance, isn't it? The tendency itself, the categorization, seems almost hardwired, maybe even useful in a basic way. But it's the content of those categories, the actual stereotypes we hold, and how rigidly we apply them. That's where the problems really start.
Exactly. And connecting back to that psychological relief idea, sure, stereotypes might make a complex world feel easier to navigate, but that feeling of ease doesn't justify the damage done by harmful, inaccurate ones.
Right. The tendency might be adaptive, but the specific harmful stereotypes. That's the real issue.
That's it.
Okay, so that's kind of what's happening inside our individual heads. But the source then zooms out, looks at the bigger picture. Society. How do our cultures shape the stereotypes we end up learning and using?
Yeah, so here we shift from individual brain stuff to the shared beliefs within a whole community, how stereotypes get passed down, reinforced through culture. Social role theory is a really key idea here.
Social role theory. Okay, what's that about?
It suggests that we often mistakenly assume that the roles we see different groups playing in society actually reflect their inherent traits, their nature.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So, for example, if we always see, say, one group doing mostly caregiving work, we might wrongly jump to thinking, oh, they must just be naturally more caring.
Exactly that. Or if another group is concentrated in certain jobs, we might incorrectly think that's, all they're really suited for.
So the core insight from social role theory is that what we observe out there in society gets misinterpreted as what's innate in people.
Precisely. Seeing these patterns leads to this often false conclusion that these characteristics tied to the role are just fundamental to the group, and culture is absolutely vital in this process.
How so?
Well, stereotypes aren't just random. They're products of our history, aren't they? The power structures in society, the stories, the narratives we tell ourselves as a culture.
And those stories get passed on through family, friends, school.
Definitely. Family, peers, education, and crucially, the media. Media plays a huge role in spreading stereotypes, making them seem normal, almost invisible sometimes.
Like a constant amplifier.
Absolutely. And one fascinating, though kind of disturbing, pattern the source highlights is this historical recycling of stereotypes.
Recycling, what do you mean?
Well, negative traits that were once pinned on a group that's maybe become more accepted over time, those same negative traits might then get reapplied to a new group that's facing marginalization.
Wow. So the target changes, but the nasty label gets reused.
Pretty much. The core insight there is kind of unsettling. Societies often seem to have this, toolkit of negative stereotypes ready to deploy onto whichever group is currently seen as the other.
It paints a picture of these things being incredibly sticky, almost self-perpetuating. We're born into a world where they already exist. We get taught them, subtly or not so subtly, and then everything around us just keeps reinforcing them.
It's a cycle, really. How society is structured influences the roles people play. Those roles lead to observations. Those observations harden into stereotypes.
Which they get taught.
Right. Taught and internalized, often helping to maintain the very structures that created them in the first place.
Which leads to the question, who actually benefits from all this at a societal level? It sounds like it helps keep things as they are, especially if as they are isn't, entirely fair.
That's a key point.
So a core insight here might be that stereotypes often work to justify existing power imbalances.
Exactly. Stereotypes can act to legitimize, to maintain existing social hierarchies by making inequality seem sort of natural or deserved.
Like saying, well, that group is just naturally better at leading, or this other group is more suited to manual labor.
Precisely those kinds of ideas. It makes the dominance of certain groups seem reasonable, justified. And this connects directly to something called social dominance theory, which I think we'll get into a bit more later.
Okay, good. So we've got the individual brain, the societal influences. Now let's bring in cognitive science. What does that perspective add to the mix?
Cognitive science introduces a really, really important distinction. The difference between explicit and implicit stereotypes.
Explicit and implicit.
Explicit ones are those we're consciously aware of. We might even say them out loud. Implicit stereotypes, though, they operate under the surface, outside our conscious awareness.
So they influence our thoughts, our actions, our decisions, but we might not even realize it.
Exactly. That's the tricky part. The core insight here is that our biases can be active even when we genuinely, consciously believe in equality and fairness.
So even if I think I treat everyone the same, I might still have these unconscious biases based on, associations I've picked up over the years. That's a bit sobering.
It is. These implicit stereotypes live in our subconscious, built up from just absorbing associations from our environment, media, culture, everything. And they can get triggered automatically.
Just by seeing someone from a certain group?
Yeah.
Or even just a word or an image?
Yeah, exactly. A cue related to the group can be enough.
The source mentions a tripartite view of intergroup attitudes. Can you break that down? How do the pieces fit together?
Sure. It basically divides our attitudes towards other groups into three components. First, you have stereotypes, that's the cognitive part, our beliefs, our expectations about a group.
Okay, the thinking part.
Then there's prejudice, that's the affective, the emotional part, our feelings, positive or negative towards that group.
Right, the feeling part.
And finally, discrimination, that's the behavioral part, the actions we take based on those stereotypes and prejudices.
Beliefs, feelings, actions. Got it.
And what's really interesting from the cognitive science view is how often that first part, the stereotype, the belief, operates outside of our conscious control, unconsciously.
Sounds like stereotypes are functioning almost like mental templates, these organized ways of thinking, schemas that help us quickly make sense of the world and people.
That's a great way to think about it, schemas or mental models. The key insight is definitely that our brains use these templates for efficiency.
To process information quickly.
Exactly. But, again, there's a cost. This speed means stereotypes are often exaggerated, often negative, and really resistant to change, even when we meet people who clearly don't fit the mold.
And the fact that these implicit stereotypes can drive our behavior, even when we consciously reject prejudice, That goes a long way to explaining why bias is just so persistent, doesn't it?
It really does. It highlights that gap that can exist between what we say we believe and how we actually act in situations involving different groups.
Hmm.
Plus, this template-like nature, this schema aspect, it leads to confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias. We look for evidence that fits what we already think.
Exactly. We tend to notice and remember stuff that confirms our stereotype while we ignore or dismiss or somehow explain away anything that contradicts it.
Which makes a stereotype even stronger in our minds.
It's a self-reinforcing loop. Makes them incredibly hard to shake.
Okay, so we've explored the what and the how of stereotyping. Let's tackle the big why or where from. Where did this all begin? What's the origin story, the evolution of stereotyping?
Well, this takes us way back into our evolutionary history. Evolutionary psychology has some ideas here.
Like what?
The suggestion is that favoring our own group, they call it in-group favoritism, is probably a deeply ingrained mechanism, something that likely gave our ancestors an edge.
An advantage. How?
In terms of cooperation, survival, sticking together, trusting your own group more readily, the core insight here is pretty fundamental. A tendency to favor us over them might just be part of our basic human wiring.
So this us versus them thinking, it could have been a survival tool, a quick way to figure out who's friend and who might be foe, especially when resources were scarce.
That's the dominant thinking, yeah. Early humans lived in these relatively small, often competing groups. Being able to quickly tell who was in and who was out was pretty crucial.
Right, so seeing outsiders as different, maybe dangerous or just less reliable, that could literally mean life or death sometimes.
It likely did. So the mental processes that allow stereotyping probably developed alongside these pressures. Strong group bonds, quick assessments of outsiders. Even if those assessments weren't always accurate, they supported basic survival needs.
So in that context, stereotypes weren't just learned ideas. They were almost like features of our biological hardware, maybe. Quick categorizations for threat assessment, opportunity assessment.
That's one way to frame it.
That definitely clicks with my earlier thought about stereotyping linking to, pain relief, survival, getting ahead. Relieving pain could be avoiding harm from outsiders. Making lives longer is pure survival. And wealthy, healthy? Well, that's about securing resources and status, often through in-group cooperation against outgroups.
Exactly. Those fundamental drivers, safety, longevity, resources, were likely supported by this ability for rapid social categorization and in-group cohesion. But, and this is crucial to emphasize, while the capacity for stereotyping might be evolved, the specific content of the harmful stereotypes we see today about race, gender, religion, whatever, that is built upon this foundation by our cultures and societies. The wiring might be old, but the specific programs are written by us.
Got it. And stereotyping isn't some modern invention tied to, mass media, right? The source is clear. It's ancient.
Absolutely not modern. The core insight is really that stereotyping is a long-standing, probably universal human tendency.
Examples?
Oh, all through history. Ancient civilizations had them. Early modern Europe had clear stereotypes based on religion, social class. In the U.S., you see powerful stereotypes about Native Americans, enslaved Africans, wave after wave of immigrant groups.
It sounds like the specific group targeted might change, but the underlying process just keeps going. And those negative traits just get recycled.
That recycling pattern seems very common, yes. Applied to different groups as historical circumstances change.
And sadly, these stereotypes have been used to justify some truly awful things throughout history.
Absolutely. History shows stereotypes playing a powerful role in justifying massive social injustices, dehumanizing indigenous peoples, justifying slavery, fueling anti-Semitism. They aren't just abstract thoughts. They can be incredibly dangerous tools used for oppression.
Okay, so we've touched on the deep origins. What are some of the main theories that explain how specific stereotypes actually develop and stick around today?
Well, social learning theory is a big one. We touched on it a bit.
Right, learning from others.
Exactly. It proposes we learn stereotypes simply by observing others, imitating them, and being, rewarded or maybe punished for certain attitudes and behaviors from family, friends, teachers, and especially media. The core insight is straightforward. We learn stereotypes from the world around us.
So if kids constantly see stereotypical portrayals on TV or hear biased comments at home, they're likely to just absorb those views.
Very likely, yes. Media is particularly powerful in transmitting stereotypes across generations, shaping perceptions even if you never meet someone from the group being stereotyped.
Okay, what else?
Then there's scapegoat theory. This one suggests that when people feel frustrated or face hardship like economic problems or social insecurity,
Yeah.
they might redirect their anger and blame onto a less powerful group, an outgroup, using negative stereotypes to justify that hostility.
Like blaming immigrants for unemployment when the real economic causes are way more complex. That makes a kind of uncomfortable sense finding an easy target.
It does. It offers a simple explanation and a target for all that frustration. The core insight of scapegoat theory is really that stereotypes can become a convenient outlet for displaced anger.
Provides a false sense of control, maybe.
Perhaps. Another angle comes from terror management theory, or TMT.
Terror management. Sounds intense.
It links stereotyping to our basic underlying fear of death. The idea is, when we're reminded of our own mortality, we tend to cling more tightly to our own cultural beliefs or worldview. And groups that have different beliefs can suddenly feel more threatening. So, using negative stereotypes against these outgroups helps reinforce our own sense of security and the rightness of our own way of life.
So during times of crisis, like a pandemic or maybe a war, we might see more negative stereotyping if people try to cope with that deeper existential anxiety.
That's the prediction from the theory, yes.
Yeah.
And finally, social dominance theory, which we mentioned before.
Right, about hierarchies.
Yes. It focuses squarely on how stereotypes function as legitimizing myths, stories we tell ourselves to justify social hierarchies.
How does that work?
By attributing characteristics to dominant groups that make them seem naturally suited for power, and characteristics to subordinate groups that make their lower positions seem, well, natural or inevitable.
So it makes inequality look fair.
Exactly. It directly answers that question of who benefits those at the top.
Yeah.
And it ties into that idea of becoming wealthy, healthy through these hierarchies that stereotypes help maintain. The core insight of SDT is that stereotypes are often tools for justifying and preserving social inequality.
Wow. Okay, so stereotypes have these incredibly deep roots kept alive by this complex mix of our own psychology and the way society is set up.
Yeah.
Now, let's pivot to the impact. How do they actually affect us as individuals, our thoughts, feelings, actions?
Oh, the effects are profound. Stereotype threat is a major one.
Stereotype threat, what is that exactly?
It's the anxiety someone feels when they're in a situation where they worry they might confirm a negative stereotype about their group.
Okay.
And paradoxically, that very anxiety can actually hurt their performance in that specific area. The core insight is chilling. The fear of confirming a stereotype can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So, like, a student from a group stereotyped as being bad at math might actually do worse on a math test because they're stressed about confirming that stereotype.
Precisely that example. And it's been documented across many different groups, many different domains, academics, athletics, social interactions.
Wow.
And then you have internalized stereotypes. This is where individuals from stereotyped groups actually start to believe the negative messages society sends about them.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it leads to self-doubt, lower expectations for oneself, self-limiting behaviors. The core insight here is just how powerful stereotypes can be. They can literally shape how people see themselves.
That sounds like a vicious cycle. Stereotype threat hurts performance, which then seems to confirm the internalized stereotype.
It really can be. And even stereotypes that seem positive on the surface, like the model minority idea applied to some Asian groups.
Yeah, those can be bad too.
They can have definite negative consequences. They create immense pressure, anxiety about failure, and they erase individuality. People feel like they're just seen as a label, not a unique person.
Reduced to a category.
Exactly. Emotionally, well, negative stereotypes obviously fuel prejudice feelings like fear, anger, disgust towards the stereotyped group. But it's particularly complex for people in marginalized groups.
How so?
Their own emotional expressions can get misinterpreted through stereotypical lenses. Think of the angry black woman stereotype, for instance.
Right.
This leads to what sociologists call emotional labor, having to constantly manage your emotions to avoid confirming negative stereotypes. The core insight is that stereotypes affect not just how others see you, but how you're allowed to express your own feelings.
So people might feel they have to constantly police their own emotions. That sounds absolutely exhausting.
It is incredibly draining.
What about humor? The source mentioned humor based on stereotypes.
Right. Disparagement humor. Sometimes making jokes based on stereotypes can create a sense of bonding within the group making the joke. Reinforces their identity.
But for the group being joked about?
For them, it's often deeply hurtful. It can feel humiliating, dehumanizing, cause real anger or sadness. So the crucial insight is that stereotype-based humor usually comes at someone else's expense. Even basic emotions, like crying or laughing, can be interpreted differently depending on the stereotypes held about the person expressing them.
And it goes beyond feelings and self-perception, right? The source says stereotypes hit our basic needs, even our ability to concentrate.
Absolutely. Think about healthcare. Stereotypes held by doctors or nurses can lead to real disparities in the quality of care people receive. It can affect diagnoses, treatment plans, how patients are listened to.
That's serious.
And the chronic stress of just dealing with discrimination day in, day out, that has measurable negative effects on physical health.
Wow.
Then there are barriers to basic resources. Stereotypes linked to poverty can make it harder to get adequate food. Clean water, safe housing, even things like how much food someone eats can be judged through a stereotypical lens.
And concentration.
Well, imagine the sheer mental effort involved in constantly navigating a world full of potential bias, always being vigilant, maybe dealing with stereotype threat. It leads to mental fatigue, makes it harder to focus, and just generally lowers life satisfaction. The core insight is stark. Stereotypes have tangible, negative impacts on people's fundamental well-being, health, safety, resources, even the ability to think clearly.
It sounds like the ripple effect just keeps expanding, beyond the individual, impacting relationships, society itself.
Definitely. Stereotypes act like filters in almost all our interactions, with parents, children, friends, teachers, colleagues, neighbors. They shape our expectations, how we interpret behavior. And these biases can easily get passed down through generations.
And then they get embedded in our institutions.
Yes. We see discrimination fueled by stereotypes in education, like biased discipline or lower teacher expectations. In healthcare, as we said. In the justice system, think racial profiling, biased sentencing. And of course, in the economy, hiring biases, wage gaps, wealth inequality, cycles of poverty. The core insight is crucial. Stereotypes aren't just abstract ideas, they get built into the very systems and structures of our society.
And the result of all that can be a breakdown in social cohesion, less trust between groups.
Exactly. It undermines trust, fuels intergroup conflict, and in the worst cases, can escalate to violence, cruelty, even dehumanization.
Dehumanization.
Yeah.
That connects back to the earlier point about cruelty, about people seemingly lacking empathy. Stereotypes can pave the way for that.
They absolutely can. By stripping individuals or entire groups of their human qualities through intense negative stereotyping, our natural empathy can be shut down. Our moral inhibitions weaken.
It makes it easier to harm others if you don't see them as fully human.
Precisely. That thought experiment you mentioned, being born without empathy. But with AI's pattern recognition for stereotypes, it highlights this danger. A purely categorical way of thinking, devoid of empathy, could indeed enable cruelty by removing that sense of shared humanity. The core insight is sobering. Dehumanization, often rooted in stereotypes, erodes our moral compass and makes terrible acts possible.
And stereotypes even seep into our wider belief systems, our cultural values, religious interpretations, philosophical ideas about human nature.
They do. Our existing beliefs can shape the stereotypes we adopt, and stereotypes, in turn, can seem to validate those beliefs. It becomes this reinforcing loop. Even fundamental concepts like truth and lies get tangled up, where stereotypes function as these widely accepted falsehoods that people within a certain belief system hold to be true.
This is all incredibly tangled. Now let's bring AI back into this complex picture. How does artificial intelligence actually understand human stereotypes?
Well, the first thing to stress is that AI's understanding is fundamentally different from ours. It's not about social context or ethics for the AI.
Right. It's about patterns.
Exactly. AI identifies patterns in the data it's trained on. And that data, it often comes from the internet, from society, and it reflects all the biases that already exist out there. So the core insight is critical. AI learns from biased human data.
So if the data is biased, the AI becomes biased. It learns our mistakes, like teaching a student with a flawed textbook.
That's a perfect analogy. The AI learns associations. If the data constantly links, say, certain jobs with certain genders, the AI learns that link. It replicates it. It doesn't know it's a stereotype or that reproducing it might be harmful.
And given the enormous amounts of data AI digests, often uncurated data scraped from the web, it seems like a breeding ground for bias.
It really can be. And we see bias manifesting in AI in several ways. There's data bias. The training data itself is skewed or unrepresentative. There can be algorithmic bias. The design of the AI itself introduces or magnifies bias. Plus things like selection bias, confirmation bias, and how the AI filters information, measurement bias. And specifically related to stereotypes, we see stereotyping bias in natural language processing, how AI understands and generates text, and in computer vision, how it interprets images.
So that could look like AI chatbots making stereotypical assumptions, or maybe facial recognition working less well for certain groups.
Precisely those kinds of issues. AI might even exhibit something like the outgroup homogeneity effect, treating individuals from less represented groups as more similar to each other than they really are. The fundamental limitation is that current AI just doesn't grasp human intent, emotional nuance, or the dynamic social context where stereotypes live and breathe. The core insight remains. AI struggles with the subtleties of human social understanding and is prone to mirroring the biases in its training data.
So back to my question about AI understanding laughter or crying.
Yeah.
It could maybe recognize the pattern of a smile or a frown in data.
Yes, it can classify the pattern.
But it doesn't have the foggiest notion of the feeling behind it. The joy, the sadness, the sarcasm.
Exactly. It lacks that genuine emotional comprehension. It can correlate a smile with positive words in its data, but it doesn't understand happiness or amusement. That's a huge gap.
So AI isn't just passively reflecting our biases. It can actively perpetuate them, maybe even make them worse.
It absolutely can. We're seeing examples across different areas. AI in hiring might screen out resumes based on biased historical patterns. Healthcare algorithms might misdiagnose based on skewed data. Even voice assistants or text generators can produce stereotypical language or portrayals. The core insight here is definitely that AI can take existing human biases and scale them up, spreading them faster and wider.
And the speed and reach of AI could embed these stereotypes everywhere really quickly. Plus, you mentioned the black box problem. Sometimes we don't even know why the AI is making a biased decision.
Exactly. It can be very difficult to trace the bias back to its source within a complex AI system, making it hard to fix. And then there's the amplification effect.
Amplification.
Because AI is often seen as objective, scientific, people might trust its outputs more readily. If an AI output reflects a stereotype, people might unconsciously take that as validation of the stereotype, reinforcing it in their own minds.
Making it even harder to challenge.
Yes. And some research suggests that stereotype-confirming information tends to propagate more easily through AI-driven systems than counter-stereotypical information does. It's an asymmetry.
Okay, so let's really compare head-to-head. Human understanding versus AI's pattern matching. Specifically for stereotypes, what are the key differences?
Well, we've touched on some key aspects. Humans use heuristics, intuition, but we're also prone to logical fallacies when we stereotype. AI uses algorithms, processing data for correlations.
Right.
Our human pattern recognition is flexible, tied to memory, context, meaning. AI's is much more rigid, purely based on the patterns in its training data. The core insight is the nature of the processing. Humans have layers of context, emotion, and meaning that AI currently lacks.
And we have that dual process thinking, right? System 1, the fast, intuitive one where stereotypes often live. And System 2, the slower, more deliberate one, where we can actually stop and think, analyze, maybe override the stereotype. AI seems stuck in System 1 mode for now.
That's a good way to put it. It operates more like that fast, automatic system. And critically, humans have brain structures, like the prefrontal cortex, involved in self-monitoring and error correction. We can catch ourselves being biased and try to adjust.
Whereas AI needs us to step in and fix it.
Exactly. AI needs external correction. And crucially, AI lacks the emotional and motivational drivers behind so much human stereotyping: fear, the need to belong, anger, seeking status. It doesn't feel those things, so it can't truly understand the human experience or impact of stereotypes.
So it can be an unwitting accomplice, reflecting our biases without any comprehension or ethical filter. And we humans, we have the capacity for self-reflection, for recognizing the harm, even if we don't always exercise it.
Precisely. AI's bias correction right now is entirely dependent on human intervention and ethical oversight.
Now, the source also delves into biology, genetics. What do those fields tell us about the roots of stereotyping?
Social neuroscience is fascinating here. It looks at the actual brain regions involved when we perceive groups, form biases, activate stereotypes, and even try to regulate our prejudice.
So we can actually see brain activity related to this.
Yes, using techniques like fMRI and ERP. Studies identify specific areas involved in initial social categorization, in learning and activating prejudice stored in memory systems, and even in how stereotypes affect our perception, like our own race bias and face recognition, or differences in empathy towards in-groups versus out-groups. The core insight is that these complex social processes have identifiable neural underpinnings.
Wow. What about genetics? Is there like a prejudice gene?
No, the scientific consensus is definitely not that simple. While there might be very general, evolved tendencies towards categorization, towards favoring our in-group, there is no evidence for specific genes causing specific prejudices against specific socially constructed groups like races.
So race itself isn't really a biological category in that way.
Exactly. Race is overwhelmingly understood as a social construct, with far more genetic variation within supposed racial groups than between them. We have to be extremely cautious about any claims linking specific genes to complex social behaviors like stereotyping. Genetic determinism is dangerous territory here. The core insight is our basic capacity to categorize might have biological roots, but the specific stereotypes we learn and apply are overwhelmingly social and cultural, not genetic.
That's a really important clarification.
Oh.
Okay, shifting gears again, what about the philosophical or even logical dimensions of stereotyping?
Philosophically, stereotyping forces us to ask big questions. About human nature, are we inherently biased or is it mostly learned? About free will, how much control do we have over our implicit biases, and how much responsibility do we bear? It touches on consciousness, self-awareness, even the nature of truth, when stereotypes function as widely believed falsehoods.
And logic, how does that fit in?
Well, stereotypical thinking is often a minefield of logical fallacies, making hasty generalizations from limited examples, confirmation bias, as we discussed, attacking strawman versions of groups, creating false dichotomies. Recognizing these logical errors is a key step in critically evaluating and dismantling stereotypes. The core insight is that stereotyping often relies on flawed reasoning and connects to deep philosophical questions about who we are.
And stereotypes clearly intersect with how we think about almost every complex human experience: drugs, alcohol, sex, greed, truth, lies, faith, the meaning of life.
Absolutely. Our biases color how we perceive and judge behaviors and beliefs across all these domains.
And AI, learning from our data, can potentially reflect and perpetuate those specific biases too, like generating stereotypical content about religious groups or making biased assumptions and analyzing economic behavior.
Precisely. In all these deeply human, often sensitive areas, the risk exists. And the crucial difference remains. AI processes the data patterns without the human context, the emotional depth, or the ethical framework.
Okay, let's bring it back to something very concrete: concentration and basic human needs. How does stereotyping impact those for humans? And how does AI compare in its understanding?
For us humans, as we touched on, being stereotyped is incredibly disruptive. Stereotype threat creates anxiety that impairs focus. Internalized stereotypes erode confidence. Just navigating hostile or biased environments takes a huge cognitive toll. It drains mental energy, making concentration difficult.
Even though the stereotyper might feel some cognitive relief from simplifying things.
Exactly. It's a burden shifted onto the stereotyped person, and the impact on basic needs is direct. Health disparities due to biased care, barriers to accessing food or housing, reduced job opportunities impacting income and security, lower overall life satisfaction, even disrupted sleep due to stress.
So really fundamental impacts. How does AI understand this?
AI doesn't understand it in human terms at all. It doesn't experience anxiety or hunger or the stress of discrimination. It can be programmed to concentrate on a task, yes. It can analyze data and find correlations, maybe showing that certain groups have poor health outcomes or live in areas with less access to resources.
But it doesn't grasp the why in human terms, the lived experience.
Not at all. It sees the statistical patterns, but lacks any experiential understanding of need, desire, fear, or the feeling of being unfairly judged. The core insight is the vast difference between correlating data about needs and understanding the human experience of those needs being met or unmet due to bias.
Which brings us squarely to ethics. How should we think about stereotyping from an ethical standpoint?
Ethically, harmful stereotyping is problematic from multiple angles. Deontology would say it violates our duty to treat individuals with respect, as individuals rather than category members. Utilitarianism would point to the massive negative consequences, the suffering, the inequality which vastly outweigh any supposed cognitive benefit. Virtue ethics would say it's incompatible with virtues like justice, fairness, and empathy.
And who benefits most, ethically speaking?
As social dominance theory suggests, the primary beneficiaries often seem to be dominant groups who gain from maintaining the existing social hierarchy that stereotypes help justify. The core ethical insight is that stereotyping is generally wrong because it's fundamentally unfair, causes harm, and often serves to prop up unjust power structures.
And the reality of life, for people living under this constant weight of stereotypes, it sounds like limited opportunity, psychological distress, distorted self-views, strained relationships, even physical health problems. Does it ever extend beyond humans?
The source suggests our tendency to stereotype can even extend to how we perceive and treat animals, sometimes attributing human-like stereotypes to different species or breeds.
So, given all of this,
Yeah.
what can we actually do? What works to mitigate stereotyping?
It really requires a multi-pronged approach. On the individual level, it starts with awareness, recognizing our own biases, engaging in self-reflection. Intergroup contact, positive, meaningful interactions between different groups can be very powerful.
Getting to know people as individuals.
Exactly. Education is vital, promoting critical thinking, teaching about the social construction of groups, understanding systemic issues. Highlighting counter-stereotypical examples, people who defy the stereotype, helps break down rigid categories. Fostering a growth mindset, believing abilities can be developed, makes people less likely to rely on fixed stereotypes. And crucially, we need systemic changes in institutions to reduce bias in processes like hiring, education, and law enforcement. We have to actively challenge those legitimizing myths. The core insight is that tackling stereotypes needs individual effort, better social interaction, and changes to the systems around us.
And starting young seems key. How do we teach kids to recognize and push back against stereotypes?
That's incredibly important. It involves having open, honest conversations about diversity and fairness, making sure kids see diverse representations in books, toys, media, challenging biased language when we hear it, teaching critical media literacy, how to question the messages they see. Fostering empathy is huge, affirming each child's unique individuality, not just their group identity, and empowering them to speak up when they see unfairness.
It sounds like a lifelong process, really. What about intuition? Our gut feelings, they seem tied into this, right?
They are. Intuition is often the basis for those fast System 1 heuristics, which include stereotypes. Stereotypes can pop into our minds automatically based on intuitive associations.
But gut feelings aren't always right.
Exactly. They can be based on untested assumptions, learned biases. While intuition can be useful, we need to use our slower, more deliberative thinking system too to consciously check those intuitive judgments, especially when they involve other people or groups. The core insight is: be aware of your gut reactions, but don't blindly trust them when it comes to people. Engage your critical thinking.
So, thinking about AI again. Despite all its limitations and risks, could it actually help us understand or maybe even reduce stereotyping?
There is potential there, yes. AI is very good at analyzing huge data sets. It could potentially help us uncover subtle, hidden patterns of bias in society or institutions that are hard for humans to see.
Like finding bias in large-scale hiring data.
Exactly. Or modeling how stereotypes spread online. It could also potentially be used to create tools for personalized feedback, helping individuals become more aware of their own implicit biases in a safe environment, or developing educational simulations that challenge stereotypes. The core insight is that while AI is part of the problem, it might also offer some novel tools to be part of the solution if developed and used carefully.
This has really been a deep dive.
Yeah.
We've covered so much ground, from the neurons in our brain to societal structures to the lines of code in AI. It's clear stereotyping isn't simple. It's woven into how we think, how our societies work.
It really is multifaceted, rooted in cognitive needs, shaped by culture and history, and with profound consequences.
Absolutely. Impacting everything from individual well-being right up to social justice on a massive scale.
And the role of AI just adds this whole other layer of complexity. It's both a potential amplifier of the problems and maybe a potential tool to help us understand and mitigate them. It's evolving rapidly.
Definitely. So, to leave our listeners with something to think about, considering these deep roots, these far-reaching impacts, what fundamental shifts, both in how we think as individuals and how we maybe structure our societies, are most crucial if we want to foster a world that's truly equitable, truly empathetic? And maybe, how can we best leverage what we're learning about both human intelligence and artificial intelligence to actually help us get there?
That's the big question, isn't it? A lot to mull over.
It certainly is. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive today.
This is DigitView.